what do we see when we're stressed and anxious? What are the signs and symptoms? So that's something that, I get asked a lot. How do you tell if someone else is stressed? How do you tell if a student is stressed? How do we notice this? And so some of the things that we typically see are big emotions and acting out. So sometimes things like anger are a reaction to stress and anxiety. So big sort of startle reactions, or just frustration and irritation and acting out, oftentimes underneath is fear and anxiety. So really important to kind of keep that. When I work with younger students, I do a lot of talking about anger as sort of an iceberg. So the tip of what we see at the tip is the acting out, but underneath it is usually some sort of fear or anxiousness. And we don't always know that that's anxiety. Avoidance. This is a really typical thing when we're thinking about stress and anxiety. So not wanting to do assignments, not wanting to have hard conversations, not showing up to school, avoiding things that are challenging. Any kind of avoidance is usually related to underlying anxiety. And we do this all the time. I do this regularly. If there's, something that I know I need to respond to, but I don't know what to say, I have a little bit of anxiety around what am I going to say to that, I'll avoid sending that email or having that conversation. Like, this is a really typical way that we often handle our own anxiety. Worrying, of course, is a very typical one. So I do this a lot, ruminating, just worrying about things. And so you'll see this. Sometimes students will verbalize this. They'll be talking about their worries and it'll be really obvious. And then some students, they'll totally internalize and you won't know, but there's just this constant sort of worrying going on in the background. And it might show up in certain ways by their language, things like that. And it's really normal for all of us to worry. So we always have a bit of a mental script going on a lot of the time. So this is sort of a typical thing that's associated with anxiety. But then it's really important also to keep in mind that a lot of students, and also us as adults, when we're stressed and anxious, we appear completely fine. And we might say that we're completely fine. And so whenever I get asked that question, how do you tell, what are the signs and symptoms? I'm always really cautious to really reinforce that we usually, with most of the things going on in mental health in our minds, we can't necessarily tell on the outside. So, and especially the world that we live in now, we have a real culture of emotional suppression. So we have a real culture of showing everybody that things are fine, showing everybody on the surface that we're okay. And also another layer of this when we're talking about stress and anxiety is that perfectionism is a really linked to stress and anxiety. So wanting things to be right, wanting things to be perfect, wanting to look right, wanting to, that feeds into body image, eating disorders, all of those kinds of things. They're all really related. So the external image appearing fine doesn't necessarily mean anything about the underlying mental state. And sometimes it can be showing that there is a challenge. If a student is always fine, that's a bit of a red flag because no one's always fine. So if we're not seeing any emotions, we're not seeing any worrying, we're not seeing any fear, probably there's a pattern of just suppressing all of that. So that's a really important thing just when we're thinking about this. Pretty much all of us experience some level of anxiety to a certain extent at different times in our life. It's actually quite healthy to have a certain level of anxiety because it means we're paying attention and thinking about things. But of course, it can slip into things not being helpful pretty easily when it starts impeding with our day-to-day lives. So when we're thinking about these kinds of challenges, we want to put it into the context of what is actually happening in the brain, what's going on. So when we think about anxious patterns, there's a little bit of a formula of how these things develop. It always starts with a core belief. And so this is a belief about ourselves or about the world that is usually negative, usually really extreme, and usually pretty black and white. So I'll give you an example of a core belief of mine. This is a picture of me when I was 4. And I experienced when I was quite little some pretty scary things. My family was the victim of some violent attacks. And so I was pretty scared when I was little. So you can see from this photo, I was kind of, really trying to protect myself in a lot of ways. And of course, at that age, I didn't know how. So when we're little, we form these core beliefs based on the environment around us. So the core belief that I formed because I was in this scary environment was that I'm not safe. So that's a really typical core belief. When there's any kind of trauma or there's any kind of, fighting between parents or sudden change. And what's really important about this specific core belief is a lot of the kids that I see now after having come through COVID, this is a core belief that they share universally. And it might be a core belief that we all share even as adults, but especially kids having grown up in this world that they were reinforced over and over again. Things are not safe. You don't know what's going to happen. Things can change and you have no control. Sorry, but other examples of core beliefs are also, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, other people are going to leave me. There's all really common core beliefs that our brain forms based on our experiences. So we have this core belief that forms, and then we have a big emotion about it because we are emotional beings. And when we think a thought like that, I'm not safe, again, black and white, negative, pretty major, that is a very scary thing. So we have a big emotion. Sometimes our core beliefs will lead to anger. Sometimes our core beliefs will lead to sadness. And in the case of anxious patterns, the emotion is usually going to be fear. So there's this big fear that comes from feeling unsafe, really natural fear. And emotions are just signals from our body that something's happening. That's all they are. So these two elements of the pattern are completely natural and unavoidable. We all have them. So our brain is always going to form judgments about what's happening based on our earliest experiences. And I'll get into in a second how that forms, why that is. So we'll always have this lens that we're seeing things through the core belief, and then we'll always have a big emotion. Then this is the part that's important because it's the part that we have some sort of ability to change. We then have a reaction. So in the case of anxious patterns, usually the reaction is trying to make the subject of anxiety go away, trying to make it better. This is where our avoidance plays in. So for me, when I was little and I felt unsafe and I was really scared, my reaction was to always be around people. So I used to get really scary nightmares and every single night, and I really hated being alone and I was scared. And so I always wanted an adult around. Now, this is really important because as adults supporting students, the natural tendency is to want to take away the stimulus, the fear, take away their challenge, make it better for them, fix it for them. If they're really scared about writing an assignment, make it so they don't have to write it. And this is something that we have to be aware that parents will often gear towards as well. Let's make everything safe and let's make everything non-triggering, really natural, common instinct. Let's take away the subject of pain or fear. So for me, I always wanted to be around people. I felt safer when I was around an adult. Now, the problem with that, the problem with allowing our reaction to our emotions and our core belief to continue, allowing that to be our response, is what happens is it reinforces our core belief. This is how anxiety can get out of hand. Because what we learn here is that, so I'm scared, I'm alone, I think that I'm not safe. I react by needing an adult to be with me. And then when I have that adult with me, I feel better. And so I get reinforced by this belief that on my own, I'm not safe. And so this is the part that's vital because this is what we can help to change in students and to change in ourselves. We can start to shift that if we start to pay attention to what do we want this brain to learn, whether it's our brain or our students' brains or anyone's brain. What do we want the learning outcome to be? And so the way we shift this is by understanding what's actually going on in the brain when we're anxious. So no matter what the trigger is, whatever the situation is that we're in the present, whether that's a student or us as adults, when our anxiety is triggered, it's our fight, flight, or freeze response. So the animal part of our brain kicks over and we're just in survival mode. And in that state, when we're anxious, we have no logic. We have no ability to think rationally or calmly or clearly. And so this is why we make such unhelpful decisions when we're in anxious states. And this is why it is pretty much impossible to rationalize or reason with a student when they're really stressed and anxious. So there's no ability to actually think clearly. And this is why you see students and you know they know better. You know that they're capable, and all of a sudden they're in this panic and they think they can't do something. And, or they're writing a test and all of a sudden they draw a blank and they can't remember anything. And it can be devastating to watch because you know that they're capable of so much more, but it's because in that moment, they actually physically can't access that part of their brain that has that calm, rational thinking process. And so what is going on in the brain when we experience anxiety is that we literally are cut off from what we call our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that can think and process and be rational and actually make decisions about what our thoughts are, what our actions are, all of the things that we really need to do to be able to really make conscious choices. We don't have access to that. It's the back part of our brain that completely takes over. So this is an important thing to keep in mind because it helps give ourselves a little bit of a break. When we're anxious, all of us have super unhelpful patterns, and we'll get into, I'll share some of mine coming forward. We all do things that are counterproductive when we're anxious. And the really important thing is to take the shame out of that. That's for students and for ourselves, because our brain just isn't functioning in the same way that it normally does to its full capacity when we're anxious and when we're stressed, because its sole focus is on survival. And this is why we'll do things, and students will do things that in the moment take away their fear or their stressor, because that's the survival instinct, but in the long run are really terrible for them. So addictive patterns is one example of that. And in a session, I think it's maybe the third session, we get into how do we deal with addictive patterns, and we'll get into that more fully. But part of that is related to anxiety. I feel super anxious. I need to get away from this anxiety. I'm going to take this substance or eat this thing or do this activity or grab this phone because it eases that in the moment. And then we get addicted to that, and our brain actually craves that. So this is what's going on in the brain. And so in a moment of being triggered, in a certain instance, whether this is a student or this is yourself, what our brain is doing, our brain is a little bit like a computer system. Our fear response is triggered. And what our brain does is it looks through the filing system and it looks for what is the most intense version of this feeling that I've ever experienced. What's the worst thing that could happen? That's our fight or flight system's job. What's the worst thing that could happen? And that's where our core beliefs kick in. So that core belief that I shared with you about I'm not safe, which came from a very early life environment when I was between 2 and 4 years old, a situation that was ongoing for about 1.5 years, but it ended at literally the age of 4. It has no relevance to my life now whatsoever. But that core belief has stayed with me. And it will probably always stay with me because it's such a fundamental part in my brain. It's the place my brain goes when there's fear, because it goes, whoa, that could happen. And that is really scary and life-threatening. So because I know that in my awareness, I have that lived experience of something that could be very scary and life-threatening, my brain will always go there. So this is why we have such a strong anxious response, because every single one of your students and every one of you will have some version of that, whatever that looks like. So whatever the thing that was the scariest for you when you were younger, whether that was separation from your parents, or whether that was, a cruel sibling, or whether that was something scary or traumatic, your brain will go to that place, and so will your students. So that's what's going on in our brain. So how do we soothe from the inside out? How do we shift this pattern? So we take that same equation, now knowing that the core belief is always going to get triggered. We're always going to have our big emotion. That's okay. That's our brain. We can't erase that. But what we can change is agency. So this is really important. What we want to teach students is how to learn how to soothe themselves in a healthy way. So this is me with my little kitten when I was really little. Just an example of a self-soothing strategy of a I'm feeling anxious and overwhelmed. I'm gonna pet my kitten, and that's actually gonna help. That's a classic one for little kids. Doesn't matter what the action is. If we coach students to take an action for themselves, the whole outcome changes. Now, that doesn't mean we're saying, I can't help you deal with it. What we're saying is, I want to teach you and guide you and coach you so that you know you can help yourself. And that changes the whole anxious response, because what it does is it teaches our brain a new core belief. Again, it doesn't replace the other core belief because that one's there. But all of a sudden, there's a new pathway in our brain that, on the one hand, I'm not safe. But on the other hand, I can take care of myself even when I'm not safe. And this core belief then is able to, again, it doesn't make anxiety go away. We can never really get rid of anxiety, but we can have that anxious reaction and then circle around to a more grounded, solid, stable place. We can do that mentally. So what we're doing is, instead of using the external, the things around us, the trigger, instead of thinking we have to control our whole world in order to feel safe, control other people, control our environment, control our looks, whatever we're trying to control through our anxiety. Instead, we can go, I can just change my mindset. I can change how I'm thinking about this, and that's going to make me feel safe, even if the environment is not the way I want it, even if it's scary, even if I'm sitting here writing this test and I do not want to be here and it's totally freaking me out. I don't actually have to stop that exam in order to feel safe. I can, in my own mind, work with whatever's going on, whatever my strategies are, take some breaths, reframe my thoughts, whatever it is that we're teaching them to do. I can do something and I can stay in the same situation and I can feel different about it. That is when we truly start to learn how to deal with our anxiety and how to relate to our anxiety. So that's what we're trying to teach. So how do we do it? So I'm going to take you through the TREA model of resilience, which is sort of specific steps that you want to take in order to coach this to students. And again, this absolutely applies to us as well as adults. And I'm going to take you through some exercises where you really sort of feel this yourself, because that's the best way that you can learn how to teach it to your students. So there's 4 distinct steps when we're thinking about building resilience and really building up this sense of agency, so that students are learning that even though things are scary, I can help myself with it. I'm not alone in this. I have the ability to survive and the ability to thrive. So the first step, and the most important one, is being okay with the trigger. Teaching how to sit with our emotions. Now, this is the thing that our whole world is really good at not doing. Everything that we do is about avoiding our feelings. And this is why levels of anxiety are getting so much greater over time. Partly because of this cultural pattern where all we're doing is making things easier, and we have more things to distract ourselves, so we're never bored, we never feel sad, we never feel lonely. We're always trying to fix those feelings. So the only way to shift patterns of anxiety is to go the other way, and to actually use triggers as an opportunity to learn. So to really change that whole narrative and teach an ability to sit with those big feelings and be okay with those big feelings when they naturally arise. So that's the first step. The second step is teaching self-reflection, teaching that ability to notice what's happening in our brain, notice our thoughts, notice our patterns, pay attention to how we're reacting in different circumstances, and actually cultivate an ability to see what's happening for ourselves. And this is a really important skill, and one that we can teach kids of every age, but one that if we don't consciously do it, is not something that kids learn. So this is something that often, I mean, it always is taught in therapy sessions, but of course, most kids don't go to therapy. The vast majority don't go to therapy. So you have this incredible ability in school. If you start teaching these self-reflective practices, you really have the ability to change the way our whole society functions, because that self-reflection is everything. You know, why do I always feel this way every time I sit down to do homework? You know, what is going on in this friendship? Why do I feel this way in this friendship? You know, these really important reflective exercises of self-reflection really give insight into where the anxiety is coming from. And that's key. Then this is where that agency comes in, teaching effort. So really encouraging students to do things to help themselves. And then finally, being able to accept the situation. And I'll go through a few specific things of how do we get there. You know, accept the ups and downs, roll with life as it happens, even when it's scary. And it's really important to see this as a sequential step, because what we want to do usually is skip over those first three because they're challenging and they're confronting, and we just want to get to acceptance. And we want this for students and we want this for ourselves. So if we see a student distressed, we just want them to feel better. We just want them to feel like it's okay to get over it. Partly because we don't want to see them in pain. We want them to be okay. And then partly because we have a whole bunch of other stuff we need to do. The reality of life when we're trying to work with kids is we've got lots of things going on. And then also for ourselves, you know, sitting in those other three places doesn't feel nice. You know, it's sometimes really unvalidating. I mean, it's confronting to look at our patterns and to sit with our feelings. It's not nice. It's really nice when we feel like we can accept things. So it's super important that we recognize that the only way that we're actually going to change anxious patterns is by going through those other steps, and the acceptance is like the icing on the top of the cake. So let's go through those 4 steps, and I'm going to give you some specific language and sort of how you do this with students along the way. So the first layer of this is the trigger. Now, I think of this as the soil. So it's yucky, it's dirty, there's manure in it. It's not a pleasant place to be, but it's where everything grows from. So this is what we're talking about when we say sitting with our feelings, being able to just be with our feelings. So what does that look like? What exactly are we doing here when we say that? So I'm going to take you through a really quick exercise, a mindfulness exercise, where we're actually practicing that skill. How do I just be okay with a feeling? So I'm going to get you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And we'll just do it, just be a couple of minutes, and we'll just do a little practice around this. So you can just close your eyes and just take a few breaths and just relax in your chair. Okay, and we're going to actively bring up a situation in our mind that makes us anxious. So we're going to do the opposite of what we would normally do. And we're just going to spend a few minutes on it. And we're just going to practice what happens if I go towards this thing. So I want you to think of this situation that causes you anxiety, whether it's work-related or home-related, anything you want. And I want you to really picture it. Imagine that it's happening right now. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Who else is there? What are they saying? What's your environment like? Are there smells? Are there textures? Just really see if you can put yourself there right now. And then when you've really imagined the situation, I want you to let go of the story, let go of that whole image, and just focus on the feeling that you have. So see if you can locate the anxiety in your body physically. My anxiety often sits in my chest, might be in your head, might be in your belly, and just see if you can notice where you feel this. Now, you might feel really strong physical sensations. That's okay. That's totally normal. You might also feel no physical sensations. That's also completely fine and normal. Just use your imagination. It's just as powerful. So, as you're noticing this feeling in your body, I want you to see if you can describe it to yourself. So, if you had to give it a color, what color would it be? What shape would it be? What size is it? Does it have a texture? Does it have some sort of symbolism like fire or lightning? Really just see if you can notice without judgment what your anxiety looks and feels like to you. Now we're just going to keep breathing in and out. And as you breathe in and out, I want you to just feel the air coming in and out of your body. Just notice that no matter how big or intense or unpleasant this feeling is, you still have air flowing in and out of your body. Now, I want you to also notice another place in your body that feels something else, that does not feel anxious, that feels maybe grounded or calm or serene. And I want you to notice that part of your body. Maybe it's your feet or your hands. And I want you to picture that feeling. What color would it be? What shape? What size? What texture? Does it also have symbolism like cool running water or a nice warm bed? Just see if you can picture that feeling for a little bit and connect to it. Now see if you can notice both of those sensations in your body at the same time. So you're not judging one as right and one as wrong. You're just noticing these two different sensations, the anxiety and the calmness in your body at the same time. Just slowly breathe in and out, noticing the both of them. Okay, and now as we finish, I just want you to notice that first sensation, your anxiety. Just notice what happened to it. Did it get bigger? Did it get smaller? Did it stay the same? Just see if you can pay attention to what happened to that feeling of anxiety. Did your relationship to it change? Did it start to feel different? Do you feel different about it? Okay, and then just take a few more breaths and just let go of that image, and you can slowly open your eyes when you're ready. Okay, so what you just did is a really simple but significant change in the way we usually relate to anxiety. So, as I said before, usually everything that happens in our brain is telling us that the worst case scenario is going to happen. And everything that we do when our anxiety is rising is about getting away from it. This is when we get short-tempered, when we make mistakes, when we go into addictive patterns, whatever it is. And so sitting with that feeling, now that might have felt really uncomfortable for you. It might have felt really relieving. It might have felt a bit of both. There's no right or wrong. You might have also had a lot of resistance to it. Yeah, what is this crazy lady talking about? I do not want to do this right now. All of that's really normal. So whenever we do those kind of exercises where we're really looking at our mind, lots of things can happen, and it can be really illuminating for ourselves, because whatever we do in an exercise like that maybe reflects what we do in other situations in our lives. So it's just a good noticing. What happened for me there? Did I get really overwhelmed? Did I really want to disconnect from it? Or just notice. So, but what you did by staying with it and being present is that you started to teach your mind that this emotion is actually not going to lead to that worst case scenario like my brain is imagining. It's actually going to come and it's going to pass. And so some of you will have experienced that in that exercise, where as soon as you started thinking about the other emotion, you started feeling, oh, the feeling passed. You might not have experienced that. It might have been really confronting and you didn't get to that place. That's absolutely fine. It's really normal if you've never done something like that before to have that be pretty triggering. But if you sit with it enough, that's what happens always. the emotion always passes. It never lasts forever, and it's never as bad as our mind thinks it is. And so by simply just being with that emotion, you fundamentally change the relationship that your brain has with anxiety. Now, I remember when one of my first therapists tried to get me to do nothing. When I was feeling anxious, he was like, you just need to sit there and do nothing. It was one of the most confronting things that anyone ever asked me to do. And a lot of your students will feel the same. If you ask a teenager specifically, and kids are often similar to this, to sit quietly without their phone and just notice their body, that's really, really overwhelming for a lot of them. And it's because this is what's going on. So the ability that we have to teach this to students, to help put a little bit of a different spin on it and help them sit with their emotions, that completely changes how anxious they feel on a day-to-day basis. So it's really powerful. And it's really important to remember that when a student is anxious, this is not going to be your first instinct. Your first instinct is going to be to fix it, to make it better, to make it go away, because we see someone in pain and we jump to that. It's our natural thing that we want to do. So we have to be a little bit conscious about how we approach this. So there's some language we can use, some things that just help infuse this ability to just be with emotions. So really simply, how does that make you feel? So we're just, instead of trying to go straight to the fixing, we just pause and ask that question. What's happening for you right now? Then we want to reinforce, this is scary. We want to validate that feeling in students. It's, let them know that it's normal for them to feel scared when hard things happen. Disclosing things about ourselves, again, it doesn't have to be something big or heavy. Just generally in the course of our day-to-day, just stating, I'm feeling anxious about that. It's Monday and I'm feeling anxious about the rest of the week. Or, I saw something on the news and it made me feel a little bit anxious. So we're just normalizing that we have these feelings so that students don't have such a level of shame around it. They can start to pay attention to it. And then you can actually do exercises like the one I just led you through with little kids. You can get them to draw their feelings. But the whole idea is that, we're stopping and saying, let's pay attention to what's happening in our body, to our feelings. Orienting ourselves to our physical sensations is a really powerful way, especially with kids, to really help them get out of that story, because the story is where our mind's spinning. Why am I anxious and blah, 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 blah. But if we're just thinking about our body, we kind of let go of that whole core belief pattern and we're focusing on the self-soothing. That's the first step. The second step is reflection. So we think of this as the roots. So the more we reflect, the deeper we reflect, the broader and wider our base is, because the wider our roots are. So this is a really great way to think about reflection. The more you coach students to reflect, the stronger their foundation is, because the more awareness they have about what they're doing and why they're doing it. An important piece of information here to keep in mind is that 95% of our brain activity is unconscious. Unconscious, meaning it's happening without us being aware what's going on. That means we're driven by all of the things that we are not reflecting on. Anything that we are not aware of will drive us. As soon as we pull it into that 5%, as soon as we're aware of it, it doesn't have the same impact on us, because it's not coming from that place that we have no idea what's going on and it's just mindlessly driving us. So reflection is key. So the way we can do this is pretty simple. We just think of patterns. So I'm just going to take you through one of my patterns. And as I do it, just think of one of your own patterns that might relate to this. So you can kind of see of what we're trying to coach with students. So a good way to do this is to start with a trigger. So what's something that triggers your anxiety? So might have been the thing that you thought about in that last exercise. A trigger for me with my anxiety, there's a lot of triggers I have for my anxiety. Fear is a very easy thing for me to feel. So one trigger that comes up a lot with anxiety is having too much to do. So if I have a lot of things on my plate and I know I have more things than I can get done in a day, that's a trigger for me. So I will immediately feel anxious. If I look at my to-do list and I see, that's too much for a day, that triggers my anxiety. So just think of what triggers your anxiety. Maybe it's something like that. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something interpersonal. then you want to notice the thought. So anxiety is very related to what we're thinking. Remember those core beliefs. So the thought that comes up for me is, of course, I'm not going to get it done. But then, so interestingly, this does lead to a thought of, I'm not safe or I'm not okay. Like something terrible is going to happen if I don't get this done. Now, that's not logical. That's related to my core belief, which is related to my early life experiences of trauma. But that's the thought that comes up. This is not okay. And I also usually blame myself, even if that's completely illogical. So I must have messed up. I should be able to get this done. I go into that kind of self-deprecating piece. Now, when I do that, I start to feel really scared. So that's the feeling that comes up, which is, the fear, the anxiety. I also feel shame because I go into that self-doubt. So I start to feel, this shame and this fear. And then what do? So then I start rushing usually. I don't take enough breaks. I will so easily sacrifice myself. It's crazy how easily I sacrifice myself. And I know as educators, this is something that a lot of educators can relate to. Just, okay, I won't take a break, whatever it is, the narrative I tell myself. And then I usually become short-tempered with the people closest to me. So that is a really typical sort of pattern for me. So if you can do this for yourself, it will really help you when you're helping your students, because you start to see how common these patterns are. And just because I see it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And we're not trying to be perfect here. We're not trying to create a situation where we get rid of these, because everyone has them. Your students will all have them. But the more aware we are of them, the easier we can come out of them. The more we can just laugh as soon as we notice it. The more we can recognize, oh, here I am. Maybe we notice it only after we've started acting really crummy. Or maybe we notice it when we're in the feeling, or maybe we notice it when we're in the thought, or maybe we notice it right when the trigger happens. It doesn't matter when we notice it. If we notice it, we can start to do something about it. So reflection is key. So the most important skill we can teach students is the ability to look at themselves honestly and see all their unhelpful qualities and all their helpful qualities and be okay with that, not feel this shame like they have to be perfect. So some language around that. These are my patterns. Again, we don't have to disclose anything major. We can just be really general about it. When I'm driving and someone cuts me off, I start thinking, some pretty negative things about them, and then I get angry, and then I honk my horn, and, it turns into this, whatever, just lighthearted things. If we bring these up, it normalizes them for kids, and they start to see, oh, it's okay to look at these. What do you notice? So simply orienting them to, they're struggling with something. What do you notice about it? Is it something that happens a lot for you? It's so silly how we all do this. So just making light of it, not turning it into a big, huge thing. It's okay. So silly, we all do this. It's normal to feel anxious. Actually saying those words is really powerful. Okay, the next part, effort. So this is, if you imagine the tree coming up above the ground, takes a lot of effort. So really importantly here, we want to frame challenges and anxiety and situations that are tough and triggering as just having a lot of different ingredients. There's so many things going on. So there's the trigger of our anxiety, there's our thoughts, there's what other people are doing, there's our past patterns and habits, there's all of these things. And if we change just one ingredient, this is the exciting part. If we change one ingredient, the whole thing can shift. And it doesn't matter what we change. We could change our thought. We could change how we're responding. We could, just like we did earlier, we could actually sit and call the feeling up instead of trying to avoid it. We could have a confronting conversation when we would usually avoid it. If we just do one thing differently, it doesn't actually matter what it is, the whole situation can shift. So that's what we want to reinforce. And we want to help kids understand that they can be the one in charge. They can do something about this. They can do something to help themselves. So some language, you've got this, really reinforcing to them that they can handle whatever challenge they're facing that's causing them to be anxious. What can you do that will help? So I'm here to support you. I'm here every step of the way, but what can you do? So we're just asking that. We're not saying I'm not going to help you, but we're just putting it back on them. What do you think? What's something that, and you can even use language like, what can we do? So it's really inclusive. What can we do here? I'm so proud of you for trying. So it is a challenge to make change, which we all know. We've all tried to make change and failed miserably at it from time to time. It's hard to change things. So we really want to validate anything they do, any effort they take to help themselves, notice it, validate it. And how can I support you to face this? So the whole goal with anxiety is to learn that we can face the thing that scares us in little pieces. We can't face it all at once. We have a huge fear of heights. We don't want to go to a really high height and just grin and bear it. We want to really slowly go up one step. Notice the feeling, sit with the feeling, get okay with it. Okay, I can handle this. Then we go up the next step. So everything is a series of steps. And so how do I support you to face this is the most empowering thing you can do with students, because then they're learning, I can handle this feeling. Okay, finally, acceptance. This is the flowering of the tree. This is where we want to get to straight away. This is what feels really nice. Now, the important thing to know about acceptance is that we can't accept the external situations. We can't accept what's going on around us if we don't accept ourselves. Really important piece of it. And so a lot of what's happening when we're anxious is that we're doubting ourselves in that experience. So we're going to do a really quick final exercise, just a couple of minutes. I know we're right on time to finish, but just a couple of minutes. I want to do a quick exercise and then we'll finish up, just so we can notice what goes on in the brain. So I just want you to take 1 minute and I want you to write down, I want you to think of someone that's been a really positive influence on your life, someone that's been a mentor, or maybe your grandmother that was wonderful for you, or you're a pet, somebody that you really admire. And I want you to write down 5 dot point things that you admire in them, or maybe the way they make you feel, or the qualities they have, things that you really appreciate in them. Just jot down 5 of those things about someone that you really admire, that has really helped you in your life, or that has really been an incredible support or role model. So just jot down those 5 things really quickly. Okay, when you have those 5 things written down, usually it comes pretty easily to us to think of, the people that we care about, what are the qualities we admire. Now, I want you to look at that list and I want you to imagine that somebody has given this list to you, that these are things that are written about you, that someone has noticed these qualities in you. This is how you make them feel. These are the wonderful things that you possess. And I just want you to notice what it feels like to read that glowing praise about yourself. Just take a moment to read that and notice what you feel. Now, when we do this, we usually feel one of 2 ways. We either feel really good because it feels great to have affirmations said about us, or we feel really uncomfortable because we don't believe those things about ourselves. And sometimes we feel both of those things. All of that is representing the fact that our brain doesn't usually think this way. It feels so nice because it's different. And equally, we push it away because it's different. So it's why I like to do that little exercise is because we want to remember that most of us, most of the time, are not accepting ourselves. We're not walking around in a state of self-acceptance. We're usually walking around in a state of self-deprecation. And that is because of our core beliefs. That is because we've got this fight or flight system that is kind of always anxious and always trying to figure out what's wrong here so I can fix it, so I can be safe. And so in order to accept the situations around us, we have to work on self-love, and it is work. We have to actively make choices of how we're living, what we're doing, what we're taking in, what we're surrounding ourselves with in order to practice loving ourselves. So this is also a skill we need to teach students. We need to teach them how to say these things to each other and how to say these things to themselves, because we don't naturally do that. So some of the things we can do is actively ask these questions. What helps you love yourself? When do you feel most joyful? So when we're doing things we love, when we're doing things that are in line with our greatest joy, that helps us love ourselves. That's a really great way to coach students to how to feel self-love. When we're doing the thing that just lights us up, we naturally feel a sense of self-love. And related to that is a really simple but powerful question. What do you like? It's such a simple one, but for a lot of us, when you really stop and ask that question, we don't necessarily know how to answer it, and especially kids. So really orienting them to what do you like, not what do your friends like, not what have you been told to do, but what do you like? Because when they do that, they start to learn how to listen to themselves, listen to their own internal compass. And then just simply reinforcing, when I do things I love, I feel less anxious. So one of the most powerful antidotes to anxiety is a sense of purpose. So if we are connected to what we're doing, if we feel passionate about it, if we feel joy around it, it's not that we don't feel anxiety, but those other feelings are so much stronger that the anxiety feels, the only way I can describe it, it's like it feels smaller. It's like it's there, but it's down here. It's like, yeah, that's scary, but that pull to connect to our true self, our highest self, to really be the person we're meant to be in the world or do the thing that we love, it counteracts that. And so it's one of the most important things that we can provide for students. Okay, summary. The 4 steps: let them sit with the trigger, help them reflect, teach them how to help themselves, and then really help them learn how to accept themselves so that they can accept their environment. Okay, that is everything for me. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts? Happy to open it up.